When we say a Republican Party, they don't like black people, this is a perfect example of that. This Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, they have announced that they're going to be appealing last month's ruling by the Texas Appeals Court that overturned the Crystal Mason's 2018 conviction for illegal voting. Now, Crystal Mason was on federal probation for a felony conviction in 2016 when she voted in an election with a provisional ballot. Now, she says she didn't know she could not vote. This actually went to court. The folks with the probation folks said in testimony that she didn't know. She was not told. She was convicted anyway. 2 years later of voter fraud and sentenced to 5 years behind bars because state law only allows felons to vote if they have fully finished their sentence, including any parole or supervision requirements. Now, keep in mind, she had to go back to federal prison for violating the terms of her probation, and then they tacked on 2 more years of supervised release. So although she has not gone to state prison, she did have to go back to federal prison because she was indicted. On March 28th, the Texas Second Court of Appeals overturned Mason's conviction because she didn't have, quote, actual knowledge, unquote, that she couldn't vote while on federal supervised release in a tax fraud case. Now, I want to read for you the statement because this is important before I go to her attorney. And it shows you how sadistic and shameful these folks are in Tarrant County, Texas. This is the statement that they released. And when I read this for you, you're probably going to say, you got to be kidding me. This is a quote from this statement. The trial court's guilty verdict should be affirmed. Voting is a cornerstone of our democracy. This office will protect the ballot box from fraudsters who think our laws don't apply to them. Crystal Mason, a 4-time felon, was convicted of illegal voting on March 28, 2018 in a bench trial in the 432nd Judicial District Court. She was convicted based on testimony from the election judge and poll clerk that she read the provisional voter affidavit, affirmed that she provided accurate information, signed the affidavit, and testified that the affidavit language was clearly understandable to mean that a convicted felon such as herself was ineligible to vote. On March 28, 2024, the Second Court of Appeals reversed her conviction and published an opinion stating that there was evidence showing Mason may not have known she was ineligible to vote on the day she voted. The Second Court of Appeals failed to give proper deference to the trial court's guilty verdict and reweighted the evidence in favor of Mason. The Second Court of Appeals misapplied the sufficiency standard of review by not viewing the evidence in the light, y'all gonna love this here, by not viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the trial court's verdict in contravention to binding precedent for the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The Second Court of Appeals publication of its opinion creates the very real risk that future sufficiency cases will likewise be wrongly analyzed and decided. This office requests that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals grant review in this case, reverse the Second Court of Appeals decision, and affirm the trial court's guilty verdict. That's from the Tarrant County DA's office. Kim Cole, Crystal Mason's attorney, joins us right now. Kim, hate to have the fact that we're talking to you again about this case. This has been going on for 8 years. And for people who don't understand, she filed a provisional ballot. The ballot was not even counted. So it wasn't like it actually was included. That's one. They also lie in this statement, Kim, by saying that, oh, she knew this, she knew that. And then they also lie by saying that once there was evidence showing Mason may not have known she was ineligible. This is according to the court. So they're trying to say that they're wrong. There was testimony. Wasn't there actual testimony by a probation officer who said no one told her she couldn't vote? Correct?
That is absolutely correct, Roland. And it wasn't just a probation officer. He was a supervisory probation officer. He was over all the probation officers. And he testified on the stand. And this was their witness. This was not Crystal's witness. This was their witness that they called to the stand. And they asked him point blank, didn't you tell her that she was not eligible to vote? And he said, no, I did not. They conveniently leave out the fact that, they point out that she filled out a provisional ballot, filled out her, correct information. Yes, she did. Filling out a provisional ballot is not illegal. And then they go on, if she did think she was eligible to vote, or she knew she wasn't eligible to vote, who would put their right name on there, the accurate information? Who would sign the ballot if they knew they weren't eligible? She didn't know. And
yeah. And what bothers me here, again, I love this line here, that they misapplied the standard because they should have only reviewed evidence in light most favorable to the trial court's verdict. That's not their job. Their job is to look at the verdict, the prosecution, and the defense, weigh the evidence. So basically, the Tarrant County DA is saying, oh, y'all should overlook anything that doesn't make us look good.
And that's essentially what they're saying. Unfortunately, the hypocrisy is real, because we've seen time and time again that they have absolutely ignored precedent. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are right now with the Roe v. Wade situation, with affirmative action, and numerous other precedent that has provided and expanded rights for minorities. So the hypocrisy is real, right? But that is unfortunately the standard, that anytime there is an appeal, they are to view the evidence in the light most favorable to the upholding the verdict. However, that doesn't mean be ignorant. and they did not prove their case. Their witnesses contradicted each other. And what they also failed to include was that the Second Court of Appeals said that even if she had read the affidavit, there is absolutely no language whatsoever in that affidavit, because Crystal testified that she didn't read it. They're going on her two neighbors' testimony that was inconclusive that she read it. They're like, well, I think she read it. She was moving her finger. Anyway, Crystal did not actually read the affidavit. She was filling out her information, because on one side is the attestation, the other side is where she fills out her information. And she was putting her information on there because they did admonish her that she had to provide accurate information. And she made sure everything matched up with her driver's license. And so that being said, even if she read it, there's nothing in the provisional ballot affidavit that says that if you are A, B, C, and XYZ, you are not eligible to vote. Nothing in there. So how would she have known?
Here's what's also interesting. I mean, here's the deal. So she was convicted of tax fraud. She was inflating returns for her clients in terms of preparing their taxes. Okay, That's why she went. But when we read their press release, Crystal Mason, a 4-time felon. Wasn't that tied to the same case? And so they're trying to give the impression that, this is a repeat offender. This woman is a menace to society.
Yes, that is absolutely. They have continued to persecute and disparage her. Here, what they failed to. Crystal isn't a saint, Roland. I mean, she isn't. Every saint got a past, and every sinner got a future. Okay, so she does have a prior criminal history. Otherwise, she wouldn't even be in this situation to ascertain whether or not she was eligible to vote. Okay, so that's how we landed here. Yes, she is a felon. However, what they failed to acknowledge in stating that she's a 4-time felon which they also included the one where she was acquitted, this particular case, but we can look past that, right? Yeah. Anyway, in all of her other cases, Crystal pled guilty. She admitted her wrongs, even to the case that got her sent to federal prison. She has no problem holding herself accountable for the things that she's done wrong. Why on earth would she fight for 7 years to prove her innocence when in all of these other cases, she admitted her guilt because she did something wrong? She was like, I did it. I mean, I'm going to take accountability for my actions. Here, she didn't know she was not eligible. So she refuses.
I mean,
to accept responsibility.
Right. I mean, the thing that jumps out to me is, before I go to Matt and Michael with their questions. Okay. Has she gone to state prison? No. But she actually, because of this, she returned to federal prison for 2 years. You would think a common sense DA would say, okay, we've been dealing with this one case for 8 years. They literally are spending more time on this case than they have on heinous crimes that have been committed. So the waste of resources to me is unbelievable. This is, no, we're going to make an example out of this black woman. And this is about creating a chilling effect about anybody else who's formerly incarcerated in voting. The same thing they did when they attacked a black man in Houston who stood in line for 6 hours. And guess what? He was later found that he could vote. And he now says, hey, I'm not going to vote again because of what I went through. That's what this is all about.
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. I've said over and over again, in their summation in Crystal's original trial, they said they wanted to send a message to voters, much like their ridiculous, disparaging, inaccurate statement that they released yesterday. They are trying to send a message. They are trying to, quote unquote, protect the ballot box, as if, of course, Roland, you know where that comes from, as if folk like us shouldn't be there. And so they are absolutely still trying to send the same message. 7 years later, 8 years later, we're coming up on another election. 8 years later, they're still trying to send the same message. They don't want folks who look like Crystal at the ballot box. They are trying to protect the ballot box, not from fraudsters, because let's be honest, we've seen the documentation of who was committing all the voter fraud in the past few elections. They don't look like Crystal. So they're not trying to protect the ballot box from from fraudsters. They're trying to protect the ballot box from those who have been typically disenfranchised by this system. And that is the whole point of them continuing to beat this dead horse.
And correct me if I'm wrong. There was a Texas Justice of the Peace, Russ Casey, who admitted to forging signatures to get on the primary ballot. And he pled guilty to records tampering. He resigned. That happened in 2018. These folks are spending more time, and he was a elected official. They're spending more time going after her than they did going after somebody like him.
Yes.
And in fact, before that, and he was sentenced to 2 years in jail, but it was probated over 5 years. But they want to send her to prison.
They absolutely want to send her to prison because they want people who look like her. They want to protect the ballot box from folks who look like her and you and me. And want to send, and Mr. Rogers down there in Houston, they want people that look like us to fear that they may suffer the same fate. Look at what all they're doing. Look at all of the taxpayer money they're spending to put an innocent woman in prison. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Matt Manning, your question.
So, Kim, thank you first for your advocacy. You're doing stellar work. And ironically, I'm writing a PDR to the Court of Criminal Appeals as we speak. This is really kind of appreciate. But my question to you is this. First, have you ever seen an appeal like this? Because my understanding is the Court of Criminal Appeals sent it down saying y'all used the wrong construction of the statute. And the opinion that came out of the Second Court of Appeals was determining the sufficiency of the evidence. So as far as I see this is purely political. And to that end, is there any mechanism that y'all have to dismiss a frivolous appeal like you would like a Rule 91A dismissal on the civil side or any dismissal like that? Because I think it's frankly unethical to appeal it following the Court of Criminal Appeals opinion in this case. But I haven't seen the mechanism whereby you could get it thrown out, just on its face, because I don't know how to get there at all.
From my understanding, there isn't one. We will have an opportunity to file a response to their request for discretionary review. So we're still, obviously, I'm not her only attorney, and we're still evaluating whether or not we will respond, because to be quite honest, it's trash. I don't know if you read it. It's trash. And, we're debating whether or not we actually even, want to even give it the credence to draft a response. But I believe ultimately we will, because we should say something, because this does not deserve the court's review. And hopefully the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals will not take it up. But no, I don't believe there's any mechanism like on the civil side where we can just get this out of here, please. This doesn't even require one moment of your time.
I mean, I think this is sanctionable, arguably sanctionable conduct, because it's so rare that you have the top court, and Roland, for all the viewers, the Court of Criminal Appeals in Texas is like our criminal Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So this is basically the criminal Supreme Court saying, y'all got it wrong below, look at it again, them acquitting following that instruction, and then this Tarrant County DA still trying to press the issue because he doesn't want to lose in the court of public opinion. But the court has already said what it is. So I mean, to me, it's sanctionable because I don't think there's an ethical basis on which to advance this appeal. Anyway, my thoughts.
Well, I certainly hope the court actually does smack them down because this continuation of this case, it's 8 years. She voted in 2016. I'm sorry, you don't spend 8 years on a case like this. Michael?
All right, Attorney Cole, thanks for coming back on, giving us an update. First and foremost, how is Crystal doing with this new news? Number one. Number two, is there anything possibly the Department of Justice can do, the Civil Rights Division, anything like that in regards to suing Texas, what have you?
So first of all, Crystal is understandably distraught. She thought finally that this nightmare was over because it is clear that she has been targeted. They haven't put this much. I always talk about the affluenza team, the case that made national attention. This young man committed several crimes, stole a vehicle, stole alcohol, killed 4 people. And they did not advocate him going to prison. Crystal filled out a form. That's it. She filled out a form with accurate information. She didn't lie on the form. And they want to send her to prison. This is absolutely ridiculous. I would agree that the continued prosecution should be sanctionable because there is no basis for it. Absolutely no basis for it. So Crystal is not well. She's very upset. She really took particular issue with the DA's attempt to disparage her in their last statement. Their language was vile and very unprofessional. So she really took issue with that. To, paint her as a 4-time felon. No, this conviction was thrown out. So you can say, so she isn't a 4-time felon, but they just really took, called her fraudster. They they really took some low blows. And so she's not happy, and she was looking forward to moving forward with her future without this hanging over her head. She has had to worry for the last 7 years. At any moment, this case could have turned the opposite direction, and she would have been looking at 5 years in jail and prison. And so she finally thought that was over. Your second question, and I apologize, I forgot what your second
Department of
point was.
Justice, Civil Rights Division.
Yeah.
Is there any role that they can play in this?
I think there's a role that they should play. There are some issues going on in Tarrant County that definitely would. As a matter of fact, there's some other issues going on in Tarrant County. May not be known to you, but those of us locally know. I actually am drafting a DOJ complaint, not in regards to Crystal's case, but in some other infringements of rights there in Tarrant County. So the DOJ should definitely step in and actually make a move in Crystal's case too. Typically they don't get involved in pending cases, but they definitely should look at Tarrant County's prosecution, period. Not just in Crystal's case, but in their criminal prosecution, period, because I guarantee you Crystal's case is the tip of the iceberg as far as this malicious prosecution goes.
Wow. All right. Thank you.
Well, it is just, again, it is shameful to me. It is utterly ridiculous. And again, they are terrorizing this woman. That's what they're doing. Their behavior is an abomination. And I really believe that civil rights groups and others should be showing up at the Tarrant County Commissioners meeting, condemning the DA, demanding the commissioners do an audit of their department, to waste resources, to waste taxpayer resources, going after this one woman for 8 years is nuts. And I really do hope that folks in Tarrant County and Fort Worth are loudly protesting this district attorney, calling him out and demanding he answer to this, because this just makes no sense whatsoever.
I agree, Roland. I agree. And we have been, so many organizations and individuals have reached out in support of Crystal, and we are planning, they are planning some type of actual action and protest of them continuing to pursue Crystal, not just in the interest of justice, but also in the interest of fiscal responsibility. They're spending taxpayer dollars on a political narrative. And that's not how the taxpayers want their dollars spent. I would think if there are funds allocated toward fighting crime, they would really prefer that they pursue people who have actually committed crimes.
All right, I want to jump into the first story here. And, Friday's edition, the Friday, April 26th edition of Roland Martin Unfiltered. It started late, so we had a shorter show in some of the segments. I did not get a chance to talk more and talk about some of the things that make some other points that I wanted to make. So if we look here at this story dealing with Crystal Mason, okay, I want to give you a little background information and then talk about this update. All right, so there was an article from NBCnews.com on March 28th, 2024. March 28th, 2024. Texas woman's prison sentence for attempting to vote illegally is thrown out. Texas woman's prison sentence for attempting to vote illegally is thrown out. The state appeals court ruling ends a years-long saga that garnered national attention. All right. So in this piece from NBC News, now here's a picture of Crystal Mason, okay, African-American woman. It says a Texas appeals court tossed out a woman's 5-year prison sentence for voting illegally on Thursday, March 28th, 2024, ending a years-long saga that garnered national attention. Crystal Mason was sentenced in 2018 to 5 years in prison after she testified she did not know that she was ineligible to vote because she was convicted of tax fraud in 2011. She cast a provisional ballot in the 2016 presidential election with the help of a poll worker. Okay. Now, in Thursday's ruling, Thursday, March 28th, 2024, in Thursday's ruling to overturn Crystal Mason's sentence, Second District Court of Appeals Justice Wade Birdwell wrote that, quote, finding Mason to be not credible, finding Crystal Mason to be not credible and disbelieving her protestation of actual knowledge does not suffice as proof of guilt, does not suffice as proof of guilt. Now, Crystal Mason testified that when she was in prison, she was not informed that she could not vote upon her release, Judge Birdwell said. Justice Wade Birdwell said. She was not informed that she could not vote upon her release. She also, quote, emphatically denied having read the provisional ballot's affirmations detailing felon voting restrictions, testifying that she did not know she was not allowed to cast a ballot because she was on supervised release from prison, according to Judge Birdwell. Now, Crystal Mason's provisional ballot was not counted. Her provisional ballot was not counted when officials determined that she was ineligible to vote because of her 2011 conviction, the ruling said. Quote, in the end, the state's primary evidence was that Crystal Mason read the words on the affidavit, end quote, Judge Birdwell said. Quote, but even if she had read them, okay, now this is critical here to the overturning of her case, overturning of her conviction. But even if she had read them, they are not sufficient, even in the context of the rest of the evidence in this case, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, that she actually knew that being on supervised release after having served her entire federal sentence of incarceration made her ineligible to vote by casting a provisional ballot when she did so. So them not believing Crystal Mason is not enough evidence. The prosecution did not meet their burden of proof to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she actually knew that she was not eligible to vote. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, not the defense. Okay, so even in the context of the rest of the evidence in this case, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Crystal Mason actually knew that being on supervised release after having served her entire federal sentence of incarceration made her ineligible to vote by casting a provisional ballot when she did so. Okay. Now, the Court of Criminal Appeals announced in 2021 that it would consider an appeal from Crystal Mason, who was out of prison on an appeal bond, Her 2018 sentence drew national attention, and critics have rallied against the lower court's decision. All right. So March 28th, we get news that her sentence was overturned. All right. And she thought that she could put all of this behind her and move on with her life. Well, we talked about on Friday, April 26th on Roland Martin Unfiltered, that a Texas District Attorney, Tarrant County District Attorney Phil Sorrells, Sorrells, he's not satisfied, and he wants to persecute Crystal Mason some more. Okay, so there's an article from TexasTribune.org, TexasTribune.org, and I want to pull that piece up here. Tarrant County DA wants Crystal Mason's illegal voting conviction reinstated. All right, now keep in mind that this provisional ballot that she cast was not counted, but they still want her to serve a prison sentence for what they call illegally voting. Okay, so here's the latest development in this case, and all this is designed by a former Confederate state, a former state that was part of the Confederacy that took up arms to preserve slavery, and then passed laws to suppress the African American vote after Reconstruction ends in 1877. This is all geared toward suppressing the African American vote today. Tarrant County DA wants Crystal Mason's illegal voting conviction reinstated. Now, this article is from April 25th, 2024. Here's another picture of Crystal Mason as well. Tarrant County District Attorney Phil Sorrells wants Crystal Mason's illegal voting conviction reinstated, his office announced on Thursday, April 25th, 2024. Crystal Mason, a Tarrant County resident, was acquitted of an illegal voting charge on March 28th, 2024. Tarrant County District Attorney Phil Sorrells' office is now asking the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to overturn the ruling that cleared her. Now, Crystal Mason was convicted of illegal voting in March 2018 and sentenced to 5 years in prison for casting a provisional ballot in the 2016 presidential election while on supervised release for federal tax evasion. Quote, "This office will protect the ballot from fraudsters, who think our laws don't apply to them," District Attorney Phil Sorrells' office said in a statement. So they're trying to further criminalize her by referring to her as a fraudster. Now, this office, the District Attorney's office argues, the Second Court of Appeals did not give proper deference to the trial court's guilty verdict, and reweighed the evidence in favor of Crystal Mason when it overturned her conviction. Now, District Attorney Sorrells' office adds, Crystal Mason was fairly convicted based on testimony from election staff that she understood she was not eligible to vote. But Crystal Mason's attorney, one of her attorneys, Kim T. Cole, on Roland, Martin, Unfiltered, and as you saw on the show, said that's not true. Okay, the Crystal Mason has maintained she did not know she was ineligible to vote. Okay, and they said that there was a poll worker who testified that Crystal Mason read the full affidavit. Crystal Mason denies that. Okay, quote, "It is disappointing that the state has chosen to request further review of Ms. Mason's case, but we are confident that justice will ultimately prevail," Tommy Buser, B-U-S-E-R Clancy, senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of Texas, said in a statement. The Court of Appeals decision was well-reasoned and correct. It's time to give Ms. Mason peace with her family. It's time to give Ms. Mason peace with her family. Now, though it had initially upheld her conviction, the Tarrant County-based Second Court of Appeals overturned that conviction in March of 2024 after the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals instructed the lower court to,
quote, evaluate the sufficiency, end quote, of the evidence against Crystal Mason. Evaluate the sufficiency, end quote, of the evidence against Crystal Mason. Initially, the court found that Crystal Mason's alleged knowledge that she was on supervised release and therefore ineligible to vote was sufficient for an illegal voting conviction. Her alleged knowledge, okay? But in instructing it to reevaluate the case, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeal ruled the lower court, quote, erred by failing to require proof that Crystal Mason had actual knowledge that it was a crime for her to vote while on supervised release, end quote. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeal ruled that the lower court ruling was wrong because the lower court erred by failing to require proof that Crystal Mason had actual knowledge that it was a crime for her to vote while on supervised release. She had served her federal prison sentence. Now, the years-long saga began in 2016 when Crystal Mason, on advice from a poll worker, submitted a provisional ballot during that year's presidential election after she discovered her name was not on the voter roll. Her provisional ballot was rejected because she was not eligible to participate in elections while still on supervised release for a federal tax fraud conviction. She was arrested a few months later. Now, the case against Crystal Mason hinged on an affidavit that she signed before casting her provisional ballot that required individuals to swear that, quote, if a felon, I have completed all my punishment, including any term of incarceration, parole, supervision, period of probation, or I have been pardoned, end quote. A trial court judge convicted her of illegally voting, a second-degree state felony at the time, after a poll worker testified. This was when we talked to Attorney Kim T. Cole on Roland Martin Unfiltered. She mentioned this poll worker who testified at Crystal Mason's trial. Okay, a trial court judge convicted Crystal Mason of illegally voting, a second-degree state felony at the time, after a poll worker testified he watched Crystal Mason read and run her finger along each line of an affidavit. Okay, now this was presented as evidence that she understood she was not eligible to vote. Crystal Mason, however, said she did not read the entire affidavit. At trial, a supervisor, now this is another key point right here. At trial, a supervisor from the probation officer overseeing Crystal Mason's release testified that no one from that office had informed Crystal Mason that she was still ineligible to vote. So you have somebody presenting something as evidence that does not reach the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. You have a poll worker testifying that she ran her finger along each line of the affidavit. And then you have a supervisor from the probation office overseeing Crystal Mason's release testifying that no one from that office had informed Crystal Mason that she was still ineligible to vote. Now, in its 2022 ruling instructing the lower appellate court to reevaluate the case, the Court of Criminal Appeals held that Texas election law requires individuals to know that they are ineligible to vote to be convicted of illegal voting. Okay. In its 2020 ruling instruction, the lower appellate court, in its 2022 ruling instructing the lower appellate court to reevaluate the case, the Court of Criminal Appeals held that Texas election law requires individuals to know that they are ineligible to vote to be convicted of illegal voting. Well, the supervisor that is over from the probation office overseeing Crystal Mason's release testified that no one from that office had informed her that she was still ineligible to vote. Now, the law had been clarified by lawmakers in 2021 with additions to the election code stating Texans may not be convicted of voting illegally. Texans may not be convicted of voting illegally solely upon the fact that the person signed a provisional ballot, and instead required other evidence to corroborate they knowingly tried to cast an unlawful vote. Okay, now it's pathetic and sick and sad that you have Texas District Attorney Phil Sorrells, who still wants to persecute Crystal Mason after her conviction was overturned by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. But all of this deals with understanding law. All of this deals with understanding law and how law governs every aspect of our lives. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, if the African American vote does not matter, why are they working so hard to suppress the African American vote? Why are they working so hard to intimidate us? When you look at the state of Florida, the election integrity task force that Governor Ron DeSantis put together to go after people who they claimed were voting illegally. Okay, this is designed to suppress the African American vote. Now, when we look here at, there was a piece from the Washington Post, okay? And this article here from the Washington Post deals with how GOP-led efforts, GOP voter fraud crackdown overwhelmingly targets minorities and Democrats. If we look at this article here from the Washington Post, let me pull this up. And this is a piece from 2023. GOP voter fraud crackdown overwhelmingly targets minorities, Democrats. Blacks and Hispanics made up more than 75% of defendants, and Democrats nearly 60%, in a controversial push by Republicans to prosecute election cheating, according to a first of its kind analysis by the Washington Post. Now, this article is from December 20th, 2023. African Americans and Hispanics made up more than 75% of defendants, and Democrats made up nearly 60% of defendants in a controversial push by Republicans to prosecute election cheating. If we look here quickly at this piece, as Donald Trump falsely claimed the 2020 presidential election was stolen from him, Republicans in some states launched special units to prosecute voter fraud as part of a high-profile and controversial push to stamp out cheating some claimed was rampant. But the election integrity units established or expanded in 6 states after Trump's loss obtained only 47 convictions during a period in which tens of millions of votes were cast, and the units overwhelmingly targeted minorities and Democrats for prosecution, according to a first of its kind analysis by the Washington Post of nearly every prosecution. So okay, let's go through and look at this slowly. Tens of millions of votes were cast. Okay. But in 6 states that launched these voter integrity commissions, there were only 47 convictions for illegally voting. Only 47, not 47 million convictions, not 47,000, 47 convictions out of tens of millions of votes cast. And African Americans and Hispanics were heavily targeted. Now, the analysis found that 76% of defendants whose race or ethnicity could be identified were African American or Hispanic, while white people constituted 24% of those prosecuted by the units. Now, white people are according to the 2020 census, 57% of the U.S. population. But 76% of the defendants were African Americans and Latino. Registered Democrats made up 58% of those targeted whose party could be identified, while registered Republicans were 23% of those targeted. In the rest of the cases, the defendant was not registered with the political party. The Washington Post was able to determine a defendant's race, ethnicity, or political party in roughly 70% of the cases. Okay, read the rest of this piece here. This is all about voter intimidation. This is all about voter intimidation and trying to suppress the African American and Latino vote, because you have some white people, not all white people, but some white people fear that by the year 2043, they are going to be a numerical minority in this country, and they fear what's going to happen to them. Now, all white people don't fear this, but there's some, especially a lot of Republicans, who do. And they fear what's going to happen to them when they become a numerical minority in this country. Some of them feel like they are losing power. Okay. And as we talked about in my deconstruction of Candace Owens' interview on the Breakfast Club, the 2 shows that we did dedicated to that, what you have is cultural anxiety. When we look at going back to the 2016 presidential election, okay, there was a piece from the Atlantic, theatlantic.com, dealing with how it was cultural anxiety that drove white working class voters to Donald Trump. This piece right here from theatlantic.com from May 9th, 2017. So read this article right here. Let's flip over to this. It was cultural anxiety that drove white working class voters to Trump. A new study finds that fear of societal change, not economic pressure, motivated votes for the president among non-salaried workers without college degrees. Okay, this is the fear, the browning of America. That's what this is, the fear of the browning of America. Okay, so read this piece here from the Atlantic.com. It was cultural anxiety that drove white working class voters to Trump. And there were other stories that came out after the election that dealt with the same topic. Okay, now, you have to understand history to really understand this attack on voting rights. and also felony disenfranchisement laws. And your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. So I'm not just a national political commentator, and you watch me every Friday on Roland Martin Unfiltered. I'm also a historian. I've been on Roland Martin Unfiltered basically pretty much every Friday since October 2020. So it's going on 4 years. To get a better understanding of this history, if we look at this piece here from the Brennan Center for Justice, this deals with voting rights restoration in Florida, So going back to 2018, and we talked about this story on the African History Network show. We talked about it on Roland Martin Unfiltered as well. You had Desmond Meade, a former felon Desmond Meade, African American man, who led the charge. One of the main people leading the charge to restore voting rights for ex-offenders. Okay, and they put it on the ballot. He got over 60% of the vote, something like 66% of the vote. Okay. But then the Republican-controlled state legislature there in Florida then passed a bill to put restrictions on people getting their voting rights back. Okay. So you had to pay all your fines and any restitution, things like this. They put all these restrictions to limit the number of ex-offenders who could actually vote, because they know if these people voted, they will vote these Republicans out of office. So this is about maintaining power. And you've heard me say a number of times, politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Okay, politics impacts every aspect of our lives, from the water we drink to the food we eat to the air we breathe. Voting is only one small part of politics, but voting is an extremely important part of politics, because that determines who's going to hold political office, who will have political power to actually write legislation, get legislation passed, who will have political power to appoint people to the cabinets, appoint a Secretary of Education, attorney generals, whether at the federal level or at the state level. Okay. And at the federal level, it's the U.S. Senate that confirms Supreme Court justices, confirms federal judges, which are lifetime appointments, but also confirms members of the president's cabinet. Okay, whether you talk about Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Small Business Administration, Attorney General, etc. That's the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. senators are either elected or appointed by a governor. When you have a senator who dies in office or who resigns and someone else has to finish out that term, they are appointed by the governor. Okay, so you have to understand how all this comes together. I teach a whole concept called political self-defense, and political self-defense deals with understanding how laws and policies impact conditions of African Americans, and understanding the laws, and understanding how to disarm them of this weapon and use the laws to our advantage, but at least reduce the amount of harm that laws and policies inflict upon us. Okay, this is dealing with